The transatlantic slave trade, which happened in the time duration of 15th to 19th century, was a very crucial and important period of absolute horror for 12 to 15 million Africans who were transported for trade during this time. Let's go deep into the story and try to understand the pain suffered by these people through this short video. We will develop more compassion for those who faced this brutality in their lives. What do you think was the most cruel technique used by the sailors to torture the enslaved women and demean them? Do you know the duration of the ship journey for which these women underwent the torture? To know the answers to these questions, keep watching this video. From the 1400s to the 1800s, about 12 to 15 million African people were taken from Africa to places across the ocean to work as slaves. These people were taken on this journey to be sold as slaves, and their destiny was forever doomed. But this trip was just the start of a long and challenging life. This trip across the ocean usually took 7 to 13 weeks. During this long trip, the enslaved people were treated very badly and were hurt a lot in a lot of unimaginable ways. Many people to date don't even know how cruel the people running the ships were to these enslaved Africans. In our video today, we're going to talk about the terrible things that happened on these ships, the abuse. These African people who were forced into slavery experienced extreme suffering. Their journey on the ship was filled with unbearable pain and hardship. They were badly mistreated in many ways, removing them of their humanity and reducing them to mere objects or a commodity. This terrible treatment was an important method of oppression. The awful experiences these African slaves endured had long-term effects. The pain wasn't just physical, it also deeply affected their minds and emotions too. The trauma that they went through left scars not only on their bodies but also on their psychological well-being. This trauma often stayed with them for their entire lives, and it impacted their mental health and their sense of self. The way they were treated was so brutal that it left a lasting mark on their identity and dignity for the rest of their lives. The start of the abuse. From the start, when they were first bought, slaves faced very terrible treatment, especially the women. At slave auctions, women were often forced to show their bodies to prove they could have babies. This was to show they were suitable for having children. Before they were put on the ships, African slaves went through checks that were very embarrassing and made them feel disrespected. Slave sellers would bother the women and young girls a lot, touching them to see if they could have babies. Men and boys were also harmed in their private areas. All of this was part of the really disrespectful way they were treated. It was just the beginning of a long and painful journey on the ship, where they would face even more difficulties and cruel treatment. This harsh start was a clear sign of the tough and inhumane conditions they would endure during their forced journey spanning many weeks across the ocean. Both men and women slaves were squeezed into really tight and dark areas at the bottom of the slave ships. They were to be eventually sent off to distant places to work as slaves. The crew on these ships only wanted to make money and didn't care about the slaves' lives. This meant the slaves, especially the women, were treated very badly. The trip was very dangerous. Women, who were already not treated like humans, had an even harder time. They had no simple comforts and went through horrible experiences on the ship. It was a harsh and scary time for them, with no space to move or rest, and they were often sick and scared. The conditions were so bad that many of them got sick or even died. This journey was just the start of a life full of hardship and suffering in a new place where they had no rights or freedom. The behavior of the crew. The women on the slave ships were really mistreated by the crew. They were packed into very small spaces, which caused a lot of pain due to the cramped conditions. They suffered greatly because there wasn't enough food, and they often fell ill, leading to a high number of deaths. But being locked up in tight spaces wasn't the only hardship they faced. The crew used violence and sexual abuse as a way to show their power and control over the women. This meant that the women and girls on the ship had to go through different and more terrible experiences than others. They were not only physically hurt, but also emotionally and mentally traumatized. This abuse added to their fear and suffering during the journey. It was a constant struggle for survival, with little hope or help. The women were treated not just as captives, but also as objects for the crew's cruelty, making their journey even more painful and demeaning. They were often forced to be naked and were deprived of even basic amenities like clothing, and were also kept away from the men. Sometimes they had to stand naked in front of the whole crew, which demeaned them and took away every shred of their dignity. The enslaved women were always scared of the white sailors who might attack them at any point and would subject them to a lot of torture and pain. This was a way to show power, make the male members feel ashamed, and remind everyone that they were seen as less important than the crew members because they couldn't protect their female family members and relatives. If any slave didn't do what their master wanted them to do, they would be stripped and beaten very severely. According to Alexander Falconbridge's accounts, who was a person who saw these things firsthand, the sailors were even given complete freedom and autonomy to assault the women, including young girls, and treat them in a very bad manner, sexually. This is a testament to show how cruel and inhumane the conditions were on these ships, and how much these female slaves endured in their lives. Reports of abuse. There have even been several reports of acute abuse against young girls, including one that involved an 8 to 10-year-old who was repeatedly abused continuously throughout 3 nights by the very own captain of the ship. A lot of enslaved women felt that it was better to just give in to their master's sexual demands, because it seemed like a better alternative to other awful options, like being physically punished until they gave in, or they were even sold off to someone else if they refused to do so. Abuse towards mothers. A lot of African mothers had to undergo a second level of torture, as they had to fight to keep their little infants safe, who they had carried with them on board, or had even given birth to them on their way when they were abducted or sold. Many mothers were forcibly removed from their babies as well, and it was a different level of abuse. Pregnant women on the slave ships had a really hard time. They had to travel in really terrible conditions that often caused them to lose their babies, or their babies would die soon after birth. If a woman did have a baby while on the ship, there was no medical help or care for the newborn. These babies weren't seen as valuable in the slave trade, and the cruel sailors used them to scare and control the mothers. There is a horrifying account of the crew member tossing a baby into water and killing him to show his power. The crew members mistreated them. By learning about this history, we can start to understand how much these women suffered and how their pain has continued to affect many generations after them. Knowing this history helps us remember the importance of respecting human rights and fighting for fairness and justice. We need to keep working against any kind of unfair treatment. By understanding and thinking about the past, we can make a kinder world that includes everyone and is away from cruelty. We learned about some gruesome practices that were used on these slaves during the time. We are sure that this video has educated you about the trouble faced by these slaves. Please comment if you have heard of any bad behavior during the time that we might have missed. If you found this video insightful and well-researched, please show appreciation by liking this video and subscribing to our channel. This will help us reach a broader audience. Stay tuned to our channel till we meet next.